Three young women stood in front of a mill and posed for a photo in 1912, not thinking much of it. But 100 years later, scientists zoomed in and found a shocking detail that left them stunned. The port mill hummed with the deafening clatter of machinery, the air thick with cotton lint that drifted in the poorly ventilated room. Pearl Turner adjusted her dress and straightened her back. The photographer had asked them to step outside for just a moment. "Hurry up, Pearlie," her older sister Viola urged, smoothing down her own simple dress. "Mr. Himmel said we can't be away from our stations for more than a few minutes." "I'm coming," Pearl replied, trying not to cough as they stepped into the rare fresh air. At 9 years old, though she would turn 10 in just a couple of months, Pearl had already spent 3 years working in the mill, her small fingers quickly learning the dangerous technique required to operate the spinning machine. The man with the camera, Thomas Himmel, positioned the girls before the accounting office of the mill. Pearl stood to the left, her dark eyes revealing a maturity far beyond her years, with an expression somber yet dignified. Viola, 14 and already showing signs of fatigue that seemed to seep from her very bones, stood on the right. Between them was Penelope, a 12-year-old neighbor girl who worked on the same floor. "Stand still now," Mr. Himmel instructed, disappearing beneath the black cloth draped over his camera. A moment later, there was a flash, and the girls' images were captured forever. 3 young and rigid faces framed before the haunting workplace that consumed their childhood hours. None of them could have known that this single photograph would survive more than a century, and upon its re-entry into the world, would reveal something scientifically shocking. Pearl cast one last glance at the man with the camera before following her sister back into the mill, filled with relentless noise and floating lint that would have mind-numbing consequences in the near future. Over a century later, Professor Sonia Abernathy looked up from her computer to see her research assistant Marcus standing in her doorway, holding a manila folder with a look of excitement on his face. "What have you found?" she asked, removing her reading glasses. Marcus approached her desk and opened the folder. "It's from the Thomas Himmel collection we've been digitizing. This photograph is from 1912, 3 mill girls in Gastonia." Sonia studied the image. 3 young girls with rigid expressions standing before what appeared to be an office of some sort. "What about it? We've seen hundreds of Himmel's child labor photographs. Look at this one," Marcus pointed to the girl on the left. According to Himmel's notes, this is Pearl Turner, not quite 10 years old, who had already been working in the mill for 3 years. But that's not the extraordinary part. He flipped to another document. "I found her obituary. She lived until 1964. That's unusual for mill workers of that era, especially those who started so young. And there's more. We have records of interviews with her children from 2006 and 2007. Sonia leaned forward, her interest piqued. Professor by day and archivist in her free time, she led a life organizing details from the past for research and leisure. Recently, she had embarked on a trip down a time in history where child labor was more prominent. The topic was altogether depressing, but she bottled her emotions and faced them head-on. Marcus, her research assistant, was a ball of enthusiasm, nothing like herself. He always found the little details noteworthy, but never truly insisted on deep research unless it was truly relevant. This new case, it seemed, was definitely of some importance, at least to him. "Can we use facial recognition software on the archival image to get more information?" Marcus pleaded, almost excited, or too excited, at this point. "If we could enhance this photograph, it could really help our research efforts. I've drafted the request letter. All I need is your permission." Sonia considered his plea a moment longer before responding with a curt nod. Marcus's unusually excited state was rare but intriguing. For some reason, it gave her hope for a groundbreaking discovery. Little did she know how true this would prove to be. In the course of their research, 3 weeks later, Sonia stared at her computer screen, comparing the enhanced image with other articles and images from the Thomas Himmel database. When nothing of importance sprang up, she extended her search to other areas like weaving archives and medical journals. Marcus had done the bulk of the work, tracing and interviewing everyone related to the strange picture. At first, the mission was to study the image and figure out Penelope's identity, seeing that she was the only one out of the 3 girls without a follow-up story. However, the more they studied, the more their object of focus shifted from Penelope to Pearl, the youngest in the photo. For some reason, the pair suspected something strange about her and her story. Sonia zoomed into Pearl's picture, capturing her every essence with scrutinizing slits. She examined her face, skin tone, hair, and posture under the sepia lighting, matching every detail with the help of the medical journals spread across her desk. After 2 days of trying, she finally found a breakthrough. The university's advanced digital imaging system had revealed something in the original photograph that had gone unnoticed for over a century. Her heart raced as she realized the implications of what they found. "This changes everything we thought we knew about textile mill workers' health outcomes," she whispered, reaching for her phone to call Marcus. "Get me Dr. Harold from the medical history department." That evening, Sonia found herself addressing a room filled with professors and historians, many of whom came from the medical history department. Behind her, projected on an enormous screen, was the Thomas Himmel photograph from 1912, digitally enhanced to show details invisible to the naked eye. "Greetings, everyone," she began. "What you're looking at is perhaps one of the most significant historical medical discoveries of the decade. 3 young girls, photographed outside the Port Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina, in 1912. Like thousands of children during that era, they worked long hours in dangerous conditions, constantly inhaling cotton fibers and lint that typically led to respiratory diseases and early death." She clicked to the next slide, showing a zoomed-in image of Pearl Turner's face. The audience leaned forward in their seats, straining to see the subtle details her team had uncovered. Using advanced imaging technology developed for art restoration, we examined this photograph in unprecedented detail. What we discovered in the facial structure and visible skin markings of this 9-year-old girl, Pearl Turner, suggests she possessed a previously undocumented genetic variation. Murmurs rippled all around. Professor Lawson, a leading geneticist, shook his head in disbelief, but instead of sharing his doubts, he gave Sonia room to continue. "According to medical records we've gathered, Pearl Turner went on to live until the age of 66, which was remarkably long for someone who began mill work at age 6 or 7. Her sister Viola, however," she pointed to the girl on the right of the image, "succumbed to tuberculosis just 4 years after this photo was taken, at age 17. And just like her, 4 out of the 8 siblings died before hitting 20. This disparity within the same family raised our initial questions." Sonia clicked to the next slide, showing medical diagrams. "I believe Pearl Turner had a rare genetic variation that created increased resistance to the damaging effects of textile particles on lung tissue. My guess is she possessed a variant of the MC1R gene, which typically is responsible for regulating skin tone and other genetic variations in people." Sonia stressed her argument by pointing out the difference in skin tone between the 2 sisters in the photo. At first glance, one might think Pearl was of Hindu descent, courtesy of her dark skin and highlights. However, that wasn't entirely the case. For Professor Abernathy, beyond the usual skin and eye effects, studies have revealed that some individuals with certain MC1R variants have a lower baseline sensitivity to pain, she said calmly, hoping to hit her point home. "Notice these subtle facial markers, the slightly wider nasal passage structure, and the unique eye fold pattern. These are indicative of what we now believe is an adaptive trait that emerged in response to industrial working conditions. We don't know how, but Pearl's genes were somehow preconditioned to withstand the damaging effects of working in the mill." Marcus greeted the room before chiming in. Though this is just one documented case, the professor believes it points to a fascinating possibility that human adaptation to industrial conditions had occurred much more rapidly than we previously thought possible. This small meeting marked only the beginning. Although stunned by this new discovery, the scientists craved more information that could help them further in their research. It was on this path to further discovery that they would unwittingly stumble on more shocking finds. Within months, Sonia found herself knocking on the door of Rachel Horton, Pearl Turner's daughter, now in her 70s. The elderly woman welcomed her into a modest living room decorated with family photographs spanning generations. Rachel held the enhanced image of her mother as a child in trembling hands. "Mama never knew why she outlived all her siblings," she said quietly. "She used to say she was just stubborn." Sonia smiled. "Stubborn, yes, but also special in ways she couldn't have known. Your mother's body had a unique way of handling the mill conditions that we're only understanding now." Rachel touched the photograph gently. The trip down memory lane was bittersweet. She told Sonia all about her childhood, at least, what she remembered of it. Pearl Turner married her father, Frank Jenkins, when she was 19. The pair were laborers and, as such, lived lives that were centered around the mill. When her elder sister, Sarah, was born, Pearl quit her job at the mill. 3 years later, Rachel arrived in the family, cementing their unit of 4. Growing up, the girls never lacked much. Their house and school were catered for by the owners of the mill. Also, everyone knew everyone in this close-knit neighborhood. Rachel described a connection like no other, stating how they could pool resources for neighbors in need with no strings attached. Life was refreshing for them, but unfortunately, there were hurdles along the way, especially for Pearl, who struggled with breathing problems from time to time. Rachel grew up witnessing her mother's persistent ill health, while her father continued to work the mill. Pearl always stayed at home, devoting her time to gisting with friends and knitting clothes for Rachel and Sarah. It was always a pitiful sight to behold. Rachel confessed that she barely knew anything about her mother's family. Stories about her father's family were as clear as day. However, her mother's were always shrouded in pain and darkness. Almost everyone on Pearl's side of the family had died by the time Rachel was born. After putting up a fatal battle with the gout, Pearl's father kicked the bucket. Pearl's mother, out of shock, died of a stroke weeks later. Sarah was only 2 years old when this series of misfortunes happened. Just like her grandparents, Rachel's distant relatives from her mother's side were either lost, married off, or dead. She always attributed the misfortunes to the ills of a budding industrialized past. But Sonia had breaking news for her. Rachel's mama's genes were almost as similar as Superman's, especially her regenerative properties. Rachel glimpsed a photo of Pearl she never knew existed until now. Even with its almost faded look, she could easily spot her mother's small face. To think this little girl started getting accustomed to those dangerous machines at such a tender age. What's worse, exposure to these harsh conditions had wreaked devastating consequences on her and her family for decades to come. Her heart ached at the thought. She had breathing troubles her whole life, but unlike her brothers and sisters, she kept going. "That's what makes her so extraordinary," Sonia replied. Despite the damage to her lungs, her body had mechanisms that allowed her to repair tissue in ways others couldn't. "We believe she passed some of these traits to you and your sister, Sarah." Rachel looked up. Sarah passed away in 2008. She had asthma her whole life, but she made it to 82. "Remarkable," Sonia murmured, making notes. "And you?" "I've had my troubles," Rachel admitted, "but here I am." With Rachel's permission, Sonia's team collected DNA samples and compared them to historical records and medical histories of other mill worker families. Their findings surpassed even their expectations. Back at the University Research Laboratory, a team of scientists spent hours examining tissue samples under a microscope. Just as Sonia explained, there were genetic markers from Rachel's DNA test that confirmed their hypothesis. It was a genetic adaptation that allowed for enhanced lung tissue regeneration and cellular protection against particulate damage. And all because we zoomed in on a century-old photograph, Marcus marveled. If Thomas Himmel hadn't captured that moment, those girls would have just been 3 more forgotten child laborers, Sonia finished. Instead, They've given us a window into human adaptation that could help us develop new treatments for occupational lung diseases. After sharing her findings, word spread around the medical and science departments. By fall, Sonia found herself addressing a packed auditorium at the academic conference on historical epidemiology in Boston. The discovery transformed the old port mill itself. Now converted to upscale condominiums, it housed a small museum dedicated to its industrial past. In the center of the main exhibit stood a large print of the Thomas Himmel photograph, surrounded by the story of the discovery and its implications. Tourists gathered around as a guide explained the significance. Soon, everyone in the scientific community whispered about Pearl Turner, the young girl who possessed a genetic variation that allowed her to survive conditions that killed many of her peers, including her own sister. By 2015, Sonia's research had progressed from historical curiosity to medical breakthrough. At the Medical Research Conference in Atlanta, she addressed a room of scientists and pharmaceutical researchers. Pearl's condition, which they had collectively named Turner adaptation, was introduced as a specific genetic variation that enhances cellular repair mechanisms in lung tissue exposed to hazardous particles. The discovery already led to 2 experimental treatments for occupational lung diseases, both of which were showing remarkable promise. Some critics claimed Professor Abernathy and her team were making too much of a single case. But Sonia shunned the voice of doubt echoing around her. For her, science often began with a single observation that didn't fit the expected pattern. Its correlation with this case was glaringly obvious. Pearl Turner lived while her siblings died young. That anomaly deserved investigation. What we found since the beginning of our research, similar genetic markers in descendants of industrial workers from the Southeast, confirms our initial findings, she told an inquiry panel when challenged. I don't believe I'm exaggerating this case. By 2022, clinical trials were completed, and the first treatment based on the Turner adaptation was approved for widespread use. It made headlines in medical and scientific bulletins, marking the beginning of a new era of change in occupational lung disease. Below the headline was the Thomas Himmel photograph, 3 young girls standing before a building, their expressions serious and futures uncertain. Sonia drew a deep lesson from this situation. Behind every historical photograph, every statistic about child labor and industrial conditions, were real children with real bodies trying to survive. Some, like Leola Turner, couldn't adapt quickly enough. Others, like Pearl, found a way, without even realizing it. What do you think of Pearl's sad story and contribution to science? Leave an answer in the comments below. Thank you for watching and see you in our next video.